He joined 10 Apache women. They turned the hunters into prey. Before we begin, calm in your country so I know where the story is reaching. He never planned on hearing another human voice inside his home. Not after the life he walked away from. Not after the things he carried. Elias Crowder had learned to survive inside silence, where no one asked questions and no memories demanded answers. But one night, a storm dragged the past back to his doorstep in the form of 10 Apache women who refused to die quietly on someone else's terms. The wind rushed across the plains with a restless weight, bending the dry grass like it was warning the land of what was coming. Elias sat at a small table beside a low-burning lamp, adjusting the wick the way he had 1,000 times. It was a simple motion, something predictable in a world that no longer made sense to him. The ranch was quiet except for the creaking of old wood and the steady pulse of the storm building outside. Then came the knock, not the gentle kind meant for neighbors, not the hesitant kind meant for strangers hoping not to offend. This was a strike born from desperation, shaking the door in sharp bursts that made the lamp flame tremble. Elias paused mid-motion, listening with the tension of a man who had learned to treat every unexpected sound as a warning. The second knock came harder, followed by a woman's voice calling his name through the rain. It carried urgency, fear, and something else he couldn't name at first. 10 of us, she called. Please, we cannot stay in this storm. Elias's chest tightened. No one was supposed to know his name out here. He had spent 8 years burying it beneath silence and distance. He turned down the lamp, letting the room fall into a deeper shadow. Only the faint glow from the fireplace revealed the outline of his hands gripping the table's edge. Another voice rose behind the first, trembling from exhaustion. Elias, we are freezing. We beg you for shelter. His breath moved shallow in his throat. He stepped toward the door slowly, like each footstep weighed more than the last. He slid the iron bar aside with sound that echoed too loudly in the small room. He opened the door only a few inches, letting a thin slice of lantern light spill onto the porch. Lightning cracked across the sky, revealing 10 figures huddled together. Their dresses clung to their skin, soaked and torn. Their hair whipped in the wind. Their faces were streaked with rain but lined with determination, not defeat. One woman stood at the center with her shoulders back and her chin raised, despite the exhaustion darkening her eyes. She stepped forward. My name is Lonnie. We need a dry place until the storm breaks. Just until morning. Elias studied her through the narrow gap, unsure whether he was seeing courage or something more complicated. His instincts warned him that their presence meant danger wasn't far behind. Out on the plains, nothing drove 10 women into a night like this without a force worse than the storm pushing them forward. He hesitated only a moment longer before pulling the door fully open. Warmth from the fireplace hit them like a wave. They stepped inside quickly, dripping water onto the old wooden floor. Some whispered soft thanks under their breath. Others simply collapsed to their knees in relief. One woman held a girl no older than 6, her small arms wrapped tight around her neck. Another clutched a tightly wrapped bundle, though Elias could not yet see what it held. He shut the door behind them, sealing out the storm's roar. Lonnie stood nearest to him, her breath steadying now that she was out of the wind. She looked around his cabin, as though memorizing every detail before allowing herself to rest. Elias cleared his throat. Tell me why you came here. Lonnie exchanged a long glance with the oldest woman in the group. Then she answered, because we witnessed something a man in uniform doesn't want seen. Because the truth we carry is worth more dead than alive to the ones behind us. Her voice didn't tremble, but several of the younger women lowered their eyes. Elias's jaw tightened. He knew that tone. He'd heard it years ago from people who had survived things they were never meant to talk about. He motioned for them to sit closer to the fire while he gathered blankets from a cedar trunk he hadn't touched in months. The youngest woman, holding the small bundle, revealed a child no more than a year old. The baby's cheeks were cold and pale, breathing in shallow bursts. Elias's chest stirred in a place he had closed off long ago. He knelt beside the baby, adjusting a blanket around its small body. Lonnie watched him with a careful expression, as if weighing the kind of man he was beneath the silence. When everyone was settled, Elias sat on the edge of his chair and spoke quietly. Storm doesn't bother men determined to finish something. If someone is chasing you, they're not far. Lonnie nodded. They followed us through the night, but the storm slowed them. We hoped it slowed them enough for us to reach you. Elias frowned, not understanding. Why me? Lonnie's answer came without hesitation. Because you have lived alone long enough to know the difference between danger and truth, and because men like you do not hide from justice, even when the world expects them to. The words landed heavier than she meant. Elias looked away from the firelight, letting the shadows hide the recognition in his eyes. She was right. He had left the world because it had taken everything from him. But the desire to do what was right had never fully died inside him. It had only gone quiet. A sharp crack of thunder rattled the windows, and one of the older women flinched. The girl on her lap pressed her face into her chest. Elias stood and moved to the window, pushing the shutter open just enough to see through the darkness. The ridge beyond his pasture was lined with faint lights. Lanterns. Still, watching. His stomach tightened. He closed the shutter slowly. You were followed, he said. We knew we would be, Lonnie replied. They cannot allow us to reach people who listen. Rain ran down the cabin walls in thin lines. The storm outside raged like a living thing, but the silence inside felt heavier. Elias paced the room once, twice, thinking. He looked at the worn table, the cold lamp, the empty hooks where a family used to hang their coats. The women's presence made the house feel fuller than it had in 8 long years. Finally he spoke. What truth did you see? Lonnie exhaled, as though releasing hours of grief in a single breath. We saw a raid carried out for reasons buried under lies. We saw people punished not for what they did, but for being convenient targets. We saw decisions men in power pretend they never made. That is why those riders wait on your ridge. They want to erase the only voices left that can speak of it. Elias felt old anger stir again, heavy and familiar. Injustice had a way of finding the people who chose peace. He looked around his home and realized the life he had built in silence was no longer a place to hide. Not tonight. Not with 10 women who refused to surrender their truth. He met Lonnie's eyes. You came here because you think I'll help? No, she said softly. We came because we know you will. Outside, the storm began to soften, dropping into a cold, steady drizzle. The lanterns on the ridge remained. Motionless, patient. Elias felt a shift deep inside him, a line being drawn. A man can run from the world for only so long before fate finds him again, demanding an answer. He looked at the women before him, tired, determined, carrying truth heavy enough to crush them if they were left alone. Elias took a slow breath, steady and final. You can stay here tonight. But tomorrow, we walk toward whoever stands in your way. Together. Lonnie didn't smile. She simply bowed her head once, in the quiet way people do when something sacred is spoken aloud. And for the first time in years, Elias Crowder felt like a man stepping back into his own life. Morning on the frontier didn't begin with light. It began with the fading of darkness, a slow thinning of the night, until shapes emerged where shadows had lived for hours. Elias Crowder stood by his window long, before sunrise, watching the faint lanterns on the ridge glow like distant embers waiting for wind to rise. Behind him, the women slept in quiet clusters near the fire. Their breathing was soft, but beneath that soft rhythm lived a deeper exhaustion, one earned by days of fear running, hoping the world still had one safe place left for them. Elias didn't look away from the ridge. He could feel the eyes out there, men who believed the land belonged to them, and that silence was something they could force on others. Men who waited for storms, for fear, for darkness to weaken the people they hunted. But the storm had broken. The ground steamed with leftover rain. And the day ahead carried the weight of choices Elias hadn't had to face in 8 long years. Lonnie was the first awake. She rose quietly, as if she'd slept with one ear tuned to danger. Her eyes followed his line of sight to the ridge. They didn't move all night, she said. They won't move until they believe we're desperate enough to surrender or tired enough to slip. Elias's voice stayed low. They're patient men, but patience can be broken. Lonnie wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and stepped closer. You didn't sleep. Not a second. Her eyes softened. You've lived with storms like this before. He didn't answer. Some truths didn't need words. The silence speaking them was enough. One of the younger women stirred, whispering something in Apache before settling again. The baby made a faint sound in its sleep. The cabin felt fuller than it had in nearly a decade, as if the world had pushed life back into a place that had forgotten what it felt like. Lonnie studied him. "Tell me what worries you most." Elias hesitated. Not the riders, not the ridge, not even the truth they carried. What worried him was something far quieter. "You came here knowing the danger," he said, "and you expected me to become part of your escape. We hoped," Lonnie corrected gently. "Hope is all we had left." Elias rubbed his jaw. "Hope isn't strategy." "No," she said, "but sometimes it's the only thing that moves our feet forward instead of sinking into fear." He walked to the table and sat. His chair creaked under his weight. He felt the years pressing on him, but also something else awakening inside. Responsibility, purpose, the kind of strength that comes from having something worth protecting again. "Tell me everything," Elias said quietly. "From the beginning. No pieces missing." Lonnie took a seat across from him. The fire cracked softly behind her as the women slowly woke one by one, listening without interrupting. "It started with a survey team," she said. "A group of men sent to map our valley. We welcomed them because the land feeds us and we had nothing to hide. They said they were there to help the government decide where to place a supply route. But it was a lie." She folded her hands slowly. "Weeks later, soldiers arrived claiming we refused to relocate. They said we were hostile. They said our presence threatened settlers in the area. None of it was true." Elias's jaw tightened. He'd heard this pattern before. Different place, different faces, same justification. "They burned our homes," Lonnie continued. "They took the men, and they expected the women to disappear without leaving a trace. But we saw the men behind the raid. We saw their faces. We heard the orders they thought no one would survive to repeat." She paused, her voice steady but her eyes carrying a story too heavy for words alone. Elias nodded slowly. "The truth is what they're chasing." Lonnie looked straight into him, as if searching for any piece of doubt. "The truth is all we have left. If it dies with us, they will do this again." Elias stood and went to the front door. He didn't open it. He just pressed his hand against the wood, feeling its grain, its age, its history. For years, this door had protected him from the world. Now it felt like a barrier, keeping him from stepping into the man he used to be. "You want to get the truth out," he said. "Where?" "To anyone who listens without fear," Lonnie replied. "A judge in Red Mesa, a marshal in Durango, a council outside the territory line. Anyone who will hear our story and force the men behind this to face what they've done." Elias paced slowly, running scenarios through his mind the way he used it during the years, when every sunrise carried risk. He had built defenses around his home, not because he was hiding from life, but because he feared what life might demand from him if he stepped back into it. He stopped beside the window. "If we head west, we're exposed. If we head east, they'll cut us off. North takes us toward the ridge. South leads to an open stretch with no cover for miles." Lonnie waited, letting him think. Elias tapped the windowsill with his fingertips. "There's one place they won't expect you to go. A dry creek bed that cuts behind the southern rise. It looks dead from above, but the walls hide anyone inside it. If we move before they reposition, we can slip out unseen." Lonnie's breath steadied. "You know this land well." Elias met her eyes. "I knew it long before I tried to forget it." The women finished gathering their things, blankets, small bundles, what little they carried from the homes they'd lost. The girl clung to her mother's dress. The baby slept against the chest of the youngest woman. No one cried. No one complained. Survival had shaped them into something strong, quiet, and unbreakable. "Before we leave," Elias said, "I need to know something. Why did you choose my home? Out of every place on this land. Why here?" Lonnie walked toward him, her expression softening in a way he wasn't prepared for. "Because we heard of a man who once stood up for people who had no voice. A man who vanished afterward. Some said he died. Some said he left the world because it had taken too much from him. But one man in our village believed you were still alive. He said he'd seen you once. Years ago, traveling alone along a riverbank with grief in your eyes but kindness in your hands. Elias's heart thudded once, heavy. He knew who she meant. A man he had helped long ago during a long-forgotten storm. Lonnie held his gaze. We came here because you once helped someone who had nothing to offer you in return. Because kindness like that doesn't vanish. It only goes quiet until needed again. Elias looked away, swallowing a knot in his throat he hadn't felt in years. He turned toward the back door. Then let's go before the day grows sharp enough to cut our chances. The women gathered behind him in a silent line, their footsteps soft, their breaths controlled. The cabin that had sheltered Elias from the world now sheltered 10 lives depending on him. He felt the weight, but not as a burden, more like a calling returning to a man who thought he'd lost the ability to answer it. He opened the back door just as the first thin line of sunrise painted the sky. The land stretched before them, vast and dangerous, but filled with possibilities the darkness had hidden. He stepped forward first, and the moment his boots touched the wet earth, Elias Crowder wasn't a man in hiding anymore. He was something harder, something older, something the frontier still remembered. He was a man walking toward truth with 10 women who carried it in their hands. The sun rose behind them as they followed the dry creek bed, its pale light creeping over the ridge like a watchful eye. The storm-washed air carried the smell of wet soil and distant sage, the kind of scent that always came after a night where the earth had been pushed to its limits. Elias moved ahead, guiding the group with slow, steady steps. The dry creek twisted like a natural corridor carved for people who needed to move without being found. Its walls were high enough to hide their silhouettes, yet wide enough for the women to walk in 2 thin lines. Lonnie followed close behind him. She carried a bundle of supplies, but her eyes never stopped scanning the land above them. The other women stayed silent, their movements cautious but purposeful. Even the little girl, clinging to her mother's hand, understood the weight of quiet. Elias paused every few minutes, listening. He could feel the presence of the riders on the ridge, even when he couldn't see them. Men like that didn't give up once they believed they owned the truth. They circled the land with methodical persistence a person could almost sense pressing down on their skin. At one turn in the creek, Lonnie stepped beside him. "Are they close?" she asked. "Close enough," Elias said. "But they think we're still inside that cabin. They'll spend the morning watching the front door, waiting for a move we won't make." Lonnie exhaled slowly. "You know they're thinking well." Elias didn't answer. He didn't need to. Men driven by control acted in predictable ways. He had seen it in different places, different times, wearing different uniforms. Hour by hour, the creek bed carried them farther from Elias's land. The sun climbed higher, drying their clothes and warming their faces. The calm of daylight brought a fragile sense of safety. But Elias knew better than to trust it fully. Daylight softened fear, but it didn't erase danger. Around midday, they reached a narrow break where the creek opened into a flat stretch line with cottonwood trees. The ground was firmer there, and the sound of birds returned to the air. Elias raised his hand for everyone to stop. "We rest here," he said, "only for a few minutes. We need strength for the next ridge." The women lowered themselves beneath the trees. Some stretched their tired legs. Some shared dried cornmeal from small pouches. The girl sat beside the baby, making soft clicking sounds with her tongue that made the infant blink curiously. Lonnie sat with Elias on a fallen tree trunk. Her shoulders relaxed, but only slightly. "You've been quiet," she said. "Thinking," Elias replied. "Every mile we walk is another mile they gain behind us. They're going to realize we slipped the moment they checked the creek bed near the cabin." She folded her hands together. "And then they'll try to outpace us to the south trailhead. If they get there first, we'll have to change direction again." Lonnie watched him closely. "Do you regret helping us?" Elias paused. His answer took no thought. "No." Lonnie lowered her gaze to the dust beneath her boots. Most men wouldn't risk everything for women they met on a storm's edge. Elias stared into the distance. Most men aren't asked in a way that tests the truth inside them. She lifted her eyes back to him. "You speak like someone carrying a long story." "Everyone carries one," Elias said. "Some people just run out of pages before they're ready." The moment stretched between them, until a sudden flutter of birds lifted from the cottonwoods. The women tensed. Elias rose slowly, scanning the ridge above them. "Birds don't fly like that for nothing," he murmured. Something moved them. But nothing appeared over the ridge. No riders. No dust clouds. Just the quiet shift of nature resetting itself. Still, the silence that followed carried weight. Lonnie stood beside him. "We should keep moving." They crossed the open stretch quickly and entered a set of low hills shadowed by clusters of juniper. The land here felt older, untouched, with a stillness that seemed to hold its breath for people passing through with quiet intentions. By late afternoon, the terrain softened into rolling grassland. The wind swept across the fields in gentle waves, brushing the women's dresses like a mother hand calming frightened children. The ground sloped downward toward the faint trace of a wagon road barely used in years. Lonnie pointed. "Is that the road you spoke of?" "No," Elias said, "but it leads toward the town that can help you." We follow it west for a few miles, then break north again. A marshal lives near the foothills. He's one of the few men left who still believes truth belongs to everyone. Lonnie nodded. "If we reach him, our story survives." Elias looked at her. "No, if we reach him, the truth begins." They walked the road in a thin line, their shadows stretching long across the grass as the sun dipped lower. The warmth of the day began to fade, replaced by the cooler breath of evening. The sky shifted into soft shades of amber, gold, and deepening blue. When the sun touched the horizon, Elias called for another stop. "We won't travel after dark. Not with this many. We stay here until dawn." The women gathered near a cluster of rocks that provided wind shelter. Elias searched the road's edge for signs of tracks, finding only prints from deer and stray cattle. The absence of fresh hoof prints eased a tightness in his chest, but only slightly. Lonnie approached him as he knelt by the dirt. "Nothing new?" she asked. "Not yet," he said, "but they'll come. Determined men always do." She lifted her eyes to the fading sky. "Sometimes I wonder how many of us the world expects to break before it learns something." Elias stood slowly. "Some things aren't learned by the world. They're learned by the people brave enough to stand in front of it." Night settled softly. The women formed a small camp circle, passing around water and dried berries. The baby slept in the arms of the youngest woman, its tiny breast steady and warm against the cooling air. The girl climbed onto a rock beside Elias and sat without saying a word. Children didn't need explanations to understand who made them feel safe. She leaned her head against his arm lightly, and he didn't move away. When she finally fell asleep, her mother carried her gently to the center of the group. Elias took the first watch, leaning against a rock where he could see the road, the hills, and the sky all at once. The stars rose in fragments, then in full rivers of light. The kind of night sky only the frontier could give, wide, endless, unashamed of its own quiet. Lonnie joined him some time later, wrapped in a blanket, her step soft. "You should rest," she said. "I will," Elias replied. "Just not yet." She sat beside him and watched the horizon. "Do you think they'll find us?" Elias breathed in the cool night air. "Yes, but not tonight." Lonnie nodded, accepting the truth without fear. "What happens if your marshal listens? And what happens if he doesn't?" "If he listens, the story spreads," Elias said. "If he doesn't, we keep walking until someone does." The truth has a way of finding cracks in walls built to hide it. Lonnie turned her face toward him. "You speak like a man who stopped believing in people a long time ago." Elias looked down at his hands. "There was a time I believed too easily. Then a time I believed in nothing. Now I believe just enough to help when I can." She smiled softly. "Sometimes that is more than enough." Hours passed. The women slept. The wind hummed. The world felt paused between fear and hope, like a held breath waiting for dawn. When the first light touched the horizon, it came slowly, like forgiveness. Elias stood and stretched the stiffness from his limbs. Lonnie approached him, her hair lifted by the new morning breeze. Her eyes reflected the sunrise with quiet strength. "Today," she said, "we reached the foothills." Elias nodded. "Today, you speak your truth to someone who will carry it farther than fear ever could." The group packed their things, ready to continue the journey the storm had forced into motion. As they stepped onto the road again, the women formed a single line behind Elias, their shadows merging with his in the growing light. The land ahead waited, wide, open, quiet, a place where truth could finally breathe. And Elias Crowder, a man who once lived in silence, walked toward the rising sun with 10 women who refused to let darkness have the last word. Their steps were steady. Their hope was real, and the world had no choice but to listen. If this story moved you, make sure you subscribe for more powerful tales from the old frontier. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, and share this video with someone who loves a good Western truth. Your support keeps these stories alive.